having me, Stephanie, and definitely thanks for hyping this up on your Substack. I read it. I got back from New York yesterday. I was at the Association for the Society of Nationalities conference, and I saw that you had posted about me. I'm like, uh-oh, I need to get a look at this. So, but thank you for the kind words, here. Yeah, this is a fun paper. Yeah, when you start being an academic or when you're a researcher, they tell you not to be too attached to your papers. They're not your babies, they're not your children. Because if you do that, then every single rejection you're going to get, and I'm in the hundreds by now, is just going to be a dagger to the heart. But this one, I'm particularly proud of because it took so long because it works. I worked so hard on it, and you'll see as I go through kind of the process that went into it. But yeah, like Stephanie said, and I guess the connection here is that I am American, so maybe that's how I was able to sneak in with this one. Be like, Hartwell sounds British. Nope, he's American. Okay. So the paper's called Connected to a Sinking Ship, Firm Performance in a Besieged Autocracy. That's St. Petersburg, that's Nevsky Prospect in the late 19th century. Before I became an academic, I lived and worked around the world in international development projects. So I was in Armenia, I lived in Russia for several years, I lived in Poland, which is where I started my affiliation with Koźmiński. I worked with the World Bank Group in South Pacific. I was their resident representative in Tonga. So I come from kind of a more policy oriented side than I guess you would say your traditional academic. But I've always been fascinated with Russia, transition economics, and history. I've always been kind of a history buff, even though I was trained as an economist and I didn't really touch kind of econ history until later in my career. So why did I do it? The research question here is, how do political connections matter in an autocracy? And I use the framework of authoritarian capitalism when you have political violence. We've got lots and lots of things from the finance literature, going from like the top journals all the way down that talk about political connections. We theorize it in international business and management, but there's a lot on when it would be good for a business to have connections and when it isn't. There's very little research, and it's usually relegated to second tier journals on kind of what happens when things are falling down. When do your political connections become a liability? So what I do in this paper is I test it in Imperial Russia, which is a great case from my point of view because it's just a place of institutional contrasts. There's strong political institutions in that you have the czar, but there's weak everything else. There's no kind of bureaucracy that is effective underneath. And then, historians have written about this for a long time. But there are strong financial markets. Good buddy of mine, Steve Nafziger, who is is a way better economic historian of Russia than I am. He has called this the Hartwell thesis, which I really hope catches on because I've written lots of papers on kind of how strong financial markets were in Russia, especially in the 19th century. So you got strong financial markets, you got weak political institutions. The only way in which you can enter the system is through violence, by throwing grenades and by blowing up the czar. So you have a bloody and you have a violent 19th century. And you have all kinds of political violence. You start off with peasant rebellions, then you have emancipation of the serfs in 1861, and then Russia becomes the birthplace of modern terrorism. It's the first suicide bomber. It's, targeted assassinations. And this is really interesting for the historically minded out there. They have great data on it because they kept records. I mean, the Russians love keeping records anyway, but they had yearbooks. The socialist revolutionaries put out yearbooks from 1904 to 1907 with the names of people that they assassinated. I mean, just let me see if my governor's in there this year. Amazing, amazing data on here. So we've got, 150 years worth of just political violence. What I do in the paper is I look at one specific firm. Here's where the business part comes in. Общество Кавказа Mercury, Caucasus and Mercury, a steamship company. And it goes throughout its entire lifespan from kind of when it was merged together in the late 1850s from a private firm and a state-owned firm and then up until it was nationalized, the Bolshevik Revolution. So I've got archival stock market data, I've got stockholder meeting reports, I've got Ministry of Finance data, and I've got a database that I've been working on now for, I guess, 11 years on political violence at monthly frequency in Russia through from 1789 to 1914. And like I said, this is part of a much larger project. So I've done papers on the broader stock market that I published in Financial History Review. The jewel in the crown of this is a paper on bonds, which has been rejected by all of the top 5 econ journals and one of the top 3 poli-sci journals. So I'm still waiting on where that one's going. I've done stuff more modern on Sberbank, including one in business history. Yay, thank you, Stephanie. And kind of a follow-on on that in the Academy of Management Perspectives. Did a paper on property rights that was in the Quarterly Review of Economics and Finance. And I'm under contract with Cambridge University Press to write a book on business and imperialism in Tsarist Russia. So this is a big project. This is kind of, my life's work now. In terms of the data, there you have a sense of what I was working with. It's only available in broadsheet form. It's daily or near daily stock data. In the 1850s and the 1860s, they published data like once every 3 days. But broadsheet form, available in the library in St. Petersburg. Early on in the project, I was able to take some pictures myself. Towards the middle of the project, I had a good friend of mine take pictures of it. And then towards the end of the project, well, it was just kind of, I actually paid somebody from Georgia to go to St. Petersburg and take pictures as well, because I didn't want to ask my buddy to do it anymore. So all these people are thanked. And there's more data things that come up afterwards. But I also have monthly data that comes from researchers at Yale. The International Center for Finance have the St. Petersburg Stock Exchange project, where they've digitized in the Ministry of Finance yearbooks, the Ежегодники, that show kind of what stock prices were throughout the year, but monthly. And then as I said, I matched this against a proprietary database of political violence in Tsarist Russia. Now, the key findings was that political connections are critical in an authoritarian capitalist system, even when things are going wrong, even when they're blowing up the Tsar. The more connections you had, the better. And I theorize in the paper about kind of there's various stages of state capitalism and where you should have your connections. Like here, I say it's authoritarian capitalist, so you really want to spread throughout the system because there is a systematic way of succession, right? The Tsar dies, you know who's going to be next in line for the Tsar. So it's good to have connections everywhere. But paradoxically, as the violence got worse, the firm wanted to get closer to the crown. They cultivated more ties, mainly because there was a lot of money to be found in quelling the rebellions, a lot of money to be found in shipping troops elsewhere. So they created more rents, they created more business, and they were able to disadvantage rivals, even though they were nominally private. And interestingly, they started adding members of the royal family to their board, of their own volition, because they wanted to be even more associated. And some of the empirics I do some event studies, like around the first attempted assassination of the Tsar in 1866, when it's novel, and then the successful assassination of the Tsar in 1881, which basically gives a null result. That there's really no response of what the steamship company did. And this should be a major development. I mean, volatility went up in one of them, I think in 1881, but that was pretty much it. In the longer kind of quantitative, there's differentiation by the different types of political violence. And I thought the most interesting part was that when there was collective unrest, when there was kind of an uprising somewhere, that's when the stock took a hit. And I think the reasons are, first off, that meant they really had to ferry the troops. And it wasn't just, we're going to send them down the Caspian. It was, we're now going to requisition your ships, and we're going to for however long it takes, we're going to quell this rebellion. And the government paid lower than market rates than the passengers. So they're losing some business. Secondly, and I think this was more interesting, is that there were worries that the Tsarist system was going to collapse and that all their political connections were going to become that become useless. So when it threatened the system, that's when investors started getting skittish about being close to the czar. What I like about the paper is that, it works in this framework of varieties of state capitalism and to really kind of build on what Dorota Salai and Gerhard Schneider did in their 2021 Business and Society piece and kind of show how it operates in a historical context. Like I said, I'm working on extensions to this. We got a paper R&R for business history, it's a special issue on imperialism. Again, Stephanie. But it's really kind of kickstarted my work in this area, especially showing how underdeveloped the thinking really was. And this is in political science too. We had some ideas about authoritarian capitalism is back, but what does it mean? And so this really kind of allowed me to stretch my theoretical muscles. But it also built on work that I had done beforehand with Tim Davidi on populism. And so they kind of, dovetailed together with that literature stream. Now, Helen will talk about this, I'm sure, because she brought in someone with a background in econ, but I was able to bring in volatility modeling into management studies. This was not easy. I had so much pushback from reviewers who could not understand why I was using a generalized autoregressive conditional heteroscedastic model in management studies. They were like, why don't you just use that model to generate a volatility metric and then throw it into your ordinary least squares? And I wrote pages and pages just kind of justifying this. I said, I stood my ground, and because I thought it told a very important part of the story. So if we combine kind of the long-term volatility study with the event studies and with the case studies, it provides this holistic picture. And eventually I was able to convince the reviewers and the editor. I think there's not enough volatility modeling and IB management and strategy. This is a workhorse in finance. And what I did here is this asymmetric component Garchin mean model, which helps us to understand the long and short-term effects of political violence. So we have a permanent and a transitory component. So we can look and see what volatility is short-term and what happens long-term. So you don't need to know the math there, but this is what I fought so hard for. And like I said, I'm proud of it, that it actually worked. What else I like about this paper, the whole reason I'm talking to you guys today, is that it shows historical work can get published in FT50 journals and not just part of a special issue. But you need the right editor. My editor, the handling editor I had for this was Elisa Operti. And this paper was dead in the water without her. It had gone to ASQ and got nice reports, but basically was kind of like, we don't know really what to do with this. Then it went to Org Science, and despite having one reviewer very, very positive, it got, I think, a pretty unfair rejection. And then it went to JOM. And Elisa, I spoke with her at AOM last year, and she told me that she was my ambassador to the editor-in-chief to kind of argue that this is important, that this is a good story, that this is something that they should be publishing. And it really helped to have sympathetic editors, too. I found out after the fact who one of the editors was, one of the reviewers was, and kind of how he helped to shape it. So everything just really kind of came together here. Very important. And it was a ton of fun. Throughout my career, I was, trained as this kind of straight ahead macroeconomist, and I've gone more into institutional institutional economics. I dabble in economic and business history, and this paper turned the dabbling into full immersion. I jumped in to the deep end of the pool. Sifting through archival materials around the world was fun. It was like being a detective, seeing what each analysis would bring. But I also felt like a pioneer. Like I said, people don't use this daily data because it's locked up in libraries in St. Petersburg. So I felt like, I was bringing the data to the masses. It was really a lot of fun. And it was a collaborative effort. As I said, it grew out of a larger project that I mentioned before. I had the data and the ideas, but it took presentations, it took comments, it took friendly reads, it took the editors, it took the reviewers to really bring the paper together. I first presented this at HEMOS, Christian Stutz's kind of business and management history thing in Finland, which was the first place where someone said to me, you should try for an FT50. I was like, really? I don't even know kind of what the story is here. They're like, oh, there's a story, and you should do that. And then European Business History Conference, Association Conference, Baltic Connections, also in Finland, really helped to kind of shape it. Sandeep Pillai was the one who told me, you should send this to ASQ. Like I said, Christian Stotz, very helpful. Everything that went into this really showed kind of the best of our profession. And it could not have been completed without help from my postdoc, Boris Vinogradov, which is a funny story unto itself. I call it When Reviewer 2 Goes Wild. So the paper went through 5 rounds of review, and all but the last one were substantive and challenging. You know, I think I went through 2 rounds of conditional accept, which I was like, oh, please just accept the damn paper. But in round 2, reviewer 2 said, so I put together the event study, and I was using kind of the historical mean model, basically looking to see if the stock was jumping up or down based on what it had done in the past for this company. The reviewer says, this is a naive model. I should use a market model, one that compares the returns of the steamship company to the overall St. Petersburg Stock Exchange Market Index, which is okay. I mean, this is something that we normally do in finance. The problem is that there is no St. Petersburg Stock Exchange Total Market Index available on a daily or a near daily basis in the 19th century. So what do I have to do? I had to make one. I had to go back to the data. Instead of just doing one, I had to put everything together. I had to fashion a market index. Again, here's my contribution. This has never happened before. So I had to go back to the data, use market indexing tools to then create this daily or near daily index. Again, first time ever. The result? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. The results were almost exactly the same, which was great for convincing the reviewer. For me, I was like, oh, God, come on. So that's reviewer 2's first kind of comment. In round 3, reviewer 2 says, thanks for the index. Can you now get more from the company archives to validate the empirical results? Now, I've gone through kind of shareholder meetings and other kind of tidbits. The company did like its retrospective in the early 20th century, so I've got lots of archival data. But the reviewer wants something specific to kind of validate the empirical results. The problem was that Общество Kavkazi Mercury's archives are in Astrakhan in Russia, which is nowhere near Zurich. And also, it has kind of a couple of other things going on. If you would look at my flight path, like I said, I used to live in Russia. The last time I was there was 2018 or 2019, and honestly, I can't go back now. Yeah, stuff I've done in Poland, my work written in the Wall Street Journal, written in Foreign Affairs on kind of Russia. I can't go back until the regime changes. So, solution. I'm not going to write this one out, but I will tell you. It goes back to my postdoc, Boris Vinogradov. I know a lot of people still in Russia on the other side of the Iron Curtain. Boris knows a lot of people on the other side of the Iron Curtain. He says, you know, I have a friend who lives in Astrakhan. I said, really? Can you contact them? Well, he contacts her, and turns out that she's now in Paris. But she has a friend who's still in Astrakhan. Could that friend go to the archives? Yes, of course. Da, конечно. So this friend of a friend of a friend then goes to the archives in Astrakhan. Boris looks online on the catalog beforehand to identify which boxes she could go to. So she goes there like one day and just takes lots of pictures, which is a big no-no. You're supposed to have permission, written permission, years in advance to do this. So she's kind of takes the pictures, sends them to Boris. We route 200 euro to her account, to her friend's account in Paris, for research assistants that eventually, when they get out they'll come to Paris and take it out of their French banking account because there's nothing wrong with that. There's no sanctions busting. We transferred it to a French account. And voila, all done. Didn't have to fly to Astrakhan. And the result was that the smoking gun was found, that there were documents in there that proved how the government requisitioned Kavkazing Mercury's material to move troops to Central Asia to suppress the rebellions. I did write all this out in my response to the reviewer to just be like, you want to know what I had to do to get this? And I think with that, I was able to satisfy reviewer too. So in summation, I'm really happy with this. I'm immensely proud of the work. It won an award in my university. It's up there somewhere. And it represents about 10 years of my life. It was a tough process, as evidenced by my stories, but the reviewers were tough and fair and improved the paper substantially. The paper that is published looks nothing like the paper that was originally submitted, and I thank the reviewers for that. And it felt like just everything kind of came together, especially to tell a compelling story that matters for today. And I think that hook is really what kind of got it in to the journal and why Elisa liked it so much. We've got state capitalism on the rise, we've got authoritarian capitalism on the rise, and business becoming entangled with authoritarian impulses is never a good thing. I had a piece a month, 5 weeks ago, in Foreign Affairs talking about this, why wealthy elites come to regret their bargains with authoritarians. And it really just set me off on this new research path, thinking about state capitalism. It's relevant, but it's under-researched and it's under-conceptualized. And I think it's a gap that really matters for the world today. And finally, it let me do fun things like this seminar, which is all I really ever wanted to do. So thank you guys very much.
Thank you, Chris. That was really great and a fantastic delivery. That paper sounds about as exciting as the process of getting it published. And I hope reviewer 2 knows what they put you through, but probably not. Alrighty, Helen, do you want to take over?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Chris. Thanks for the presentation. Actually, I've read lots of your papers about populism before, so it's really nice to hear you sharing your own publication experience in person today. Oh, not in person, on Zoom today. And I've been really enjoy reading this paper because as someone born in China,